I want to make a modular system for my plugin Nell. So today I want to inspect 4 plugins that have different modular systems, some of them slightly different, others vastly different. All of them are really cool in their own ways, but some of them I'm not as used to as the others, and I can already tell you that if some plugin looks a little bit whack in my video, then it's not because it's actually whack, it's because I did not have as much time as to figure it out as for some others. Let me show you an overview which plugins I cover. Of course, Serum, Multipass, Saturn, and also Psylab. All of these have really interesting modular systems that have all their benefits and downsides, and I want to cover that. First of all, we have this music. And you have already heard and also see it here that we have some modulations going on, and we can now discuss that. First of all, Serum, just a little synthesizer. And when I turn off read, then we can see that the macro actually has 2 states. So the initial state is just a very soft sound. It has a very low cutoff frequency with this low pass. It has long and wide envelopes, and well, it has not so much reverb actually. And the other side has more reverb, also a sharper sound, because the filter is much higher. It has at least a little bit less resonance, so it's not too pokey. And we also compensated by just turning down all these things in the envelope massively. And those are the 2 sounds that are designed for this beat with this macro. And one thing that I always really love about macros is that when you actually go out of the plugin and start fiddling around with them in the pure automation lane, then you often find things that you just like more than the initial value. Like this sound that I started out with, it sounds rather polite. So when I actually went a little bit higher with this, but not so high that you can really hear the other character very well, it just got a little bit more sassy, and it just came through the whole mix a little bit better as well. And you can always work with macros like that. You can define 2 points that you consider to be really cool, and after that you can find out that some of the midpoints are actually much cooler in specific senses. And then you can go to the parts that kind of stand out in your music, like here where the drums are off, and actually make a little bit of a difference with the automation. That's the appeal of macro parameters. One interesting aspect about the parameters in Serum is they are almost all of them are automatable, even without the modulators in Serum itself. Like, let's say we have this automation down here, which is not a macro. then we can clearly hear that's a low pass filter. But there's one issue with this sort of workflow. Let's say, is it this cutoff knob? Apparently not, because it did not change. Is it this cutoff knob? Apparently yes, but we cannot see that from the pure interface that something about this will change during the song. I think that's why using macros in plugins that actually have macros is much better and much more advisable than just automating any parameter, even if it is automatable. So let's just turn that off again. As we can clearly see, macros are much cooler than normal automations, which should not be a secret to anyone anymore, but just saying. The same applies for the other modulators. Interesting thing about Serum is not all of these parameters are modulatable. Like the smoothing knob is not, but some of the other knobs in the LFO actually are none of these, but for example the rate. So you can't really look at the parameter and tell that's a real parameter. Some of them are not real parameters, others are. Like this curve is also not a real parameter, even though you can do something about it and it will serialize correctly, of course. Yeah, that's just something to keep in mind here, because it shows that plugins don't always have to make everything automatable to be cool. Obviously, because this synth is really popular, and it's not just popular for no reason. I have used it tons in my life, and it makes a lot of sense to use it from a workflow perspective. There are interesting tooltips that show you which destinations your sources have. Yeah, that really helps, because you can just go there then if you did not remember yourself anymore. And there is also a color scheme that indicates that everything that has to do with modulations is kind of blue. Like when you select something, it's blue. The modulations that are drawable are drawn in blue. And also when you drag something to a knob, then the next line that is shown here is also blue. There is only one thing blue here, which is not a modulation, actually two, which is this selector of the tabbed thing, and also the font. But yeah, and the filter. Okay, it's actually a lot of stuff that is also blue. But I would still say that there is some sort of command scheme that things that are blue might be modulators. And this also makes it very comprehensible. Is that the right word? I think. And also that there are always these little drag and drop symbols that just make it very clear that you can drag and drop it along with this drag and drop cursor. The only thing missing is that it does not show you if you can actually drop it on a parameter when you hover over it. Indeed, it actually shows you sometimes these little something went wrong cursors for a very short time span for no reason at all, and that's kind of weird. But you know, before I started making this video, I never noticed that, so apparently it's not a big deal. One thing that is also very interesting to me is how it is handled that when two parameters are on top of each other, that it still feels correctly to use them, because that is not a given. And my first thought was that there is just a hit test, a radial hit test on the inner knob, so that you have to really click on some of these spaces to modulate it. But let's just click and drag on something on the outer side, and you will notice that this actually modulates the whole thing, which shows that this is a rectangular hit test. And then I asked myself, why, if this is a rectangular hit test, then why is it so intuitive to use this with this outer knob thingy? And then I noticed that's not even a knob that you can really touch. It is just this little symbol here that pops up only when there is an actual modulation that changes the cursor to show you that this is a special thing to use, and then you can drag it just like it was the knob. But you can only drag it in this corner, and everywhere else you would drag the original knob. And that's why this is better than a normal radial hit test thing. For the radial hit test thing, you don't get the cursor response, that this is a different thing, and you also have to be really careful that you touch the right thing. Because if this was a radial hit test thing, then in order to get to the outer knob, you would have to be very careful that you touch the rectangular hit test of the second knob that sits behind the first knob, which would be annoying. So this is solved in a very great way, in my opinion. Now, of course, there's also this modulation matrix, which kind of brings this to the next level by giving you a lot of extra features, like using an auxiliary source on something that already has source, and then also decide if this should have an inverted or normal effect on this thing or bypassed. And you can set it to bipolar or normal, and then you can set the curve not only of the original source to make it distinguish from other things where you use the same source, but also do the same for the auxiliary. And then even an output, I don't even know what the output thing does, to be honest. I always really love these curve thingies because it enables you to only really write one envelope or LFO or something that you really like, but then still make it a little bit more complex and distinguishable from each other by just using these curves to further skew them in some way. Because, you know, it sounds very messy quickly to use a lot of different modulations on one patch. I usually like to just use the minimal amount of modulators, but I still want things to be complex, so it's cool. It's just the perfect way to solve this problem, in my opinion. So yeah, Serum has all these things that I really love for modulators, but there is a huge contender to Serum, which is Multipass. Everything from kilohertz, not just Multipass, but Multipass just happens to be a plugin that I actually own because it was for sale once. Multipass and the other plugins by kilohertz are much more modular than Serum and stuff. And you can also see that because when I add another effect here on one of these lanes, this is a multiband effect, by the way, if you don't know, and then try to write an automation, then it does not respond to that. It just does not like automations on any of the modules that you put here. And the reason for that is obviously because the VST, is VST a framework? What is VST? The VST API does not allow to instantiate a parameter after the plugin was instantiated. So the moment I type multipass and hit enter, every parameter has to be defined very well. And for multipass, that means the macros are defined, the LFO is defined, the envelopes defined, well, all of these envelopes, the pitch modulator, the medium modulator, and you can play snake, and it's not a modulator, it's just cool. I think we can actually see that even in the, if we look at the possibilities here in, well, where is it even? Here. Then we see the list is rather short. Well, there are some other things that you can do. Oh, there are actually some generic value thingies, but you know, there is not a lot going on here in this plugin. Everything that is here except for the value thingies is very well defined. A lot of it is just this stuff down here. So yeah, global controls and modulators. That's what Multipass has as actual modulatable, automatable parameters. While in Serum, you get all the things that you might use as a parameter, even though that's a bad workflow. Because I think it's because Serum is a little bit older, and when Serum was released, it was not, people were not very happy when a plugin had anything unautomatable in it yet. But then when kilohertz came around the corner with their modular ideas a lot of people realized that we can actually embrace new workflows by getting rid of old workflows. And if that makes sense, you see Serum has a lot of these things that are not very well defined, because that's what you need when you want to make something modular but still everything automatable. Then you have to instantiate a bunch of parameters that just have no real name but are like a dummy parameters that you might want to assign to a thing if you need it, but you usually don't need it. It just sits here and it takes away a lot of space and makes it hard to search for something. Gladly, there is MIDI learn and you never really have to search for something, so it's not a big deal anyway, but they are just different workflows and it's important to point out. So what is actually the workflow of Multipass? Well, you click on some modulators plus and it will start to blink to show you that this is the modulator that currently wants to do something. So you go to a thing and you don't drag it, you just go there, and then the little tooltip shows you that you can drag it. And we can see the typical bottom tooltip thing that is shown in most modern plugins in the bottom of the window that tells us again that we can modulate something here. And we can double click to remove. So we can just drag that now and we can see the orange line shows us that we are ending up on another value than where we left off, and it also shows us the range that got us there. Actually, let's do it differently. Let's take this modulator. Oh, damn. Okay, now let's take this one and actually drag this. Great, now let's take this one and drag it the other way around. Now let's turn them up. And we see the thing that we see here is always the result of all of the modulators together. No matter if we select this one or this one, what is shown here is the result of all of the, well, of the initial value of the parameter itself plus all the modulators that sit on it. And that also is distinguishable from how it is handled in Serum, where when there are multiple things on one thing, then you can only see one of the modulators, the one that is currently selected. And when we actually play that back now, there is another little visualization, a little point, that shows us the combined value. And this is actually a plus point for Serum in my opinion, because it has just this tiny bit of information more than Faceplant, because it does not only show the resulting value, but also which is the current modulation, the one of that you currently selected. And sometimes you just want to know what is exactly this modulator doing currently, especially if you have maxed out the macros already and you switch around between them, then you want to have maximum information about what the thing that you're currently selecting is actually doing at the moment. And since you see this little point jumping around, you know the maximum value anyway. So let's see, I already made two modulations here. I called one of them rattle, the other one zip. And what rattle is doing is, I'm trying to select it now. Now I selected it. And now that shows us the modulations where I used it. I used it to mix in the dynamics, the chorus, the dispersers, and some other dynamics processors mix. So this is basically like a very complex mix knob, and we can hear it in action in here. So yeah, it just sounds slightly different. And there is another modulation here for this cryptical looking thing, the post FX. So it comes after all of these fx, and it is actually another instance of multipass, because one incredible aspect about the kilohertz plugins is that they are actually of fractal nature. You can put them into each fucking other, which is just insane. And I tested the capabilities by actually making another signal chain here, which just consists of some fancy flanges and this little automation that I called zip, which is also some sort of dry wet thing, but it also does some other stuff with the flanges. It sounds like this. It sounds like it's zipping, and that's why I call it zip. And the difference now is that when you're on the first instance of multipass, then these are automatable by the DAW, of course, because like they're directly there, sorry. But when you have actually started being in one of the fractals of multipass, then the functionality is a little bit different. This one, the plugin couldn't know that this will ever exist when it was instantiated, so these obviously can't be automatable, and they just solved it by making everything that would normally be an automatable parameter in this plugin pop up here, and then let you put another automation on that. So this is how they solved this issue. I think they just solved it like a masterpiece. So what can we take away from this? I think Kilohertz just thought to themselves, well, since macros exist, people tend to not just use one parameter to modulate a thing. So why don't we just only make a fraction of the parameters actually automatable and use all the modular capabilities that this brings us, and in that sense make a plugin that no one has ever seen before. And multiple plugins, actually all of their big plugins work like that. So that's huge. So what's better, Faceplant or Serum? Let me know in the comments. No, seriously, I'm not really sure. Both of them are really cool, have different workflows. I'm not very used to Faceplant, to Multipass yet, just because I've spent more time with Serum, but I see that this makes a lot of sense. It's a little bit different, no drag and drop. Instead, glowing colors, and you can clearly see what you can modulate and what you can't modulate, which is different to Serum, which is cool. But some things are not very cool, like that you cannot like very nicely unselect them and still see what you can do. That's I don't know yet why it feels confusing to me, but something about this feels confusing. So let's go on with the next modular system. Actually, let's use it on the beat again. This time around we use Saturn, FabFilter Saturn. FabFilter are also known for their superior workflow ideas, but the most known plugin Pro Q2 and 3, actually it doesn't matter, is not very modular. I mean, you can add all these parameters, but they are still limited to a certain amount of filters, which indicates that this is not modular, but just hides a lot of stuff. Let's say I want to make a parallel situation where it would sound like it goes through an amplifier. I like that. So now the mix knob, let's just turn it down, which is not very interesting, but we could now use an envelope let's use an envelope follower actually. So we can already see, we can decide for which type of modulator we want to be the first one, and also the second and third and so on. So this is already kind of modular. Now we have an envelope follower, and we can put it on stuff like the mix. only problem is that I don't really like the envelope follower of this plugin, because it kind of, for something like this that clearly has a lot of dynamics. I mean, okay, it's a full beat, but you can see the waveform and you see that it has a lot of dynamics. So most envelope followers would kind of be able to pick that up and let me do something pew, 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 pew kind of, but this already has too few dynamics for this to act correctly. So you cannot really use that. Turning up the gain of this modulator is just the same as if I didn't use a modulator at all. Imagine that this sounded cool now, and actually did something interesting with the transients. And now we can try something more fancy. We can go and apply this to itself. We see, oh, this gives us a little warning symbol. So apparently it does not like to be modulated by itself. When we take an LFO and do the same thing, that in turn works. Can we do it backwards? No, because now it shows us that this makes no sense. So this is a modular system that actually informs us if we are doing something that for some reason does not seem to make a lot of sense. But I'm not really sure if this is actually limited, if we have a limited amount of modulators that we can use here. Is this automatable? So let's check out why it is automatable, if there is like a limited amount of parameters. Okay, yeah, we can see that there is a limited amount. They just instantiated a bunch of parameters for all the same modulator thingies and just say, yeah, well, if someone uses more than 6 LFOs, then they can't automate anymore. Or maybe it just doesn't work to instantiate more than 6 LFOs. So they just thought to themselves, let's just instantiate way too many parameters that we'll probably never need. And then if they actually need it, then they are pulled out, and else they just sit there. So that's the same approach that we could see in Serum. They wanted everything to be automatable, even if most people won't do that. And it makes a lot of sense, because this has not exactly the concept of a macro in it. You could only like go to the XY controller and pretend like only one of the dimensions is what you need, and then that would act a little bit like a macro. Well, actually a lot. It would act a lot like a macro. So let's just use that. Is this X? Yeah, I think it's X. Oops. No, I want to get rid of that. Thanks. Okay, yeah, right. By the way, I like that this draws a line to the modulatable thing and also highlights everything by turning everything darker and letting the parameters that can be modulated shine more. Sometimes it makes not a lot of sense because this thing also shines, but when I put something there, I see an error message that is also far too long to read and it looks ugly. So they didn't think that through very well, but everything else works very fine. Now we have this mix thing on the X, I think. Now we can use the automation. Now let's see. I actually also changed the Y value a little bit, which immediately gave us a second automation, which makes the workflow of this thing a little bit worse than it could be if they just made a normal macro. But I guess macros weren't so popular back then, so they didn't really think of it. Like we always have these transitions everywhere, but there is no transition yet at this part of the beat. So yeah, the macro works very well in Saturn as well. And now I want to talk about a very special, a very unique modular system, and it's actually not very modular at all. It's At least not what I expected it to have modular aspects. Did not turn out to be very modular. That's maybe a way to phrase it. When you know the plugin, you know then that you can do something like this with it. But that's not all. You can also do something like this. So what is modular about this? Well, let's just make a little kick and you will see what I mean. And I learned this only today, really, so this could take a little while. It has this function that gives us 4 quarter notes. I think I can even take away this MIDI note now. No, I can't. So now we have to actually tell the kick that it should use the sequencer, I think. Now let's try to automate something. And we notice it was possible to automate this parameter from the parameter section, but it was not possible to automate a curve from the spline editor, which makes sense because this apparently can have an infinite amount of curves, and that only works without actual parameters. So while this can be infinite, the way we use it is we have to assign it to things that can normally be automated. And that's in that sense rather similar to faceplant, but it's different from faceplant because the workflow is just completely different. To be honest, it's kind of really hard. It's I bought this plugin because I like the presets, and I thought to myself, if I ever have a lot of time to make music again, then I will actually have enough time to figure out how to find a good workflow in this plugin. But it's definitely not one of these plugins that automatically speak to you when you open it. And I think part of the reason is, why are there so many parameters in general? Like, this is the oscillator section. What is all this doing? 2D arrows, shape. What shape? Yeah, okay, that's kind of a wavetable X fade, but that's also sort of a wavetable function. What are these? What is this? Why warp? Why sync? What modulator? What modulator? I can turn it on, but what does it mean? The whole plugin is like that. Things are really complicated and do not really make sense for the untrained eye. The one thing that I really like about all this is that it has this spline editor, and as you know, I have a spline editor as well, and it is in fact inspired by this plugin and the fact that you can use the spline editor's output on different things. And I don't even know if you can use the output from the splines on some other parameters as well, but I do hope so, because this can be such a powerful feature. It is like a modulator, LFO type of thing that really just opens up a lot of new possibilities. You can zoom in and be very surgical about whatever you want to do, and then you can just slap it on something and it will be really cool and complex. And we can clearly see on the presets that were made by the developer that this thing is super powerful and has a really great sound if you are really into it. This might be even better if there was not like a bunch of splines that have very specific names, like this is the spline for pitch, this is the one for amplitude, and so on and so on. But if it was more like, yeah, you can make a spline, and if you want to, you can make another spline and another, and how many amounts of splines you want. And then the parameter section should be like, yeah, this is a parameter. If you want, you can, there are somewhere draggables, and you can drag one of the spline outputs to that, and then you can set the gain in some way. That would optimize the potential of this whole thing, in my opinion. And then it would easily be just as cool to use as Serum or Multipass or Saturn. Sorry if that sounded a little bit like I'm dissing Psylab. Psylab actually enabled me to come up with good kicks and bass lines for psytrance music. I just can't do that without this plugin. Really, I tried a lot and it always sounds a little bit weak, and Psylab really has this unique workflow that can make it happen, even though the workflow seems so weird, but it's also just the workflow that does this. So I can't explain that. It's just weird. It works and it's cool and it's inspiring as well. And it's 1 AM in the morning. Yeah, modulation systems. What will I do for my modulation system? Will there be drag and drop, or will stuff just light up? Will everything be automatable, or will some stuff not be automatable but still sort of automatable over some specific macros? What will be the visual response from the UI to indicate that something is modulatable or that something is a modulator? Will modulators modulate each other? We can't tell exactly yet, because it depends first of all on my taste, and I'm not sure what my taste is yet, because I can see benefits in all of this. And secondly, it depends on my skills as a programmer, because all this is super complicated and I already started implementing it. And it's like you have to wrap around your head around a bunch of very abstract concepts constantly, and you have to go deeper, multiple levels every time that you want to have something just slightly more abstract. Super annoying that there is no module for that already does that for you, because apparently a lot of plugins are successful because they have these systems. So yeah, this is really